have everyone here as we try to analyze the implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on international law and the future of development. And I'm very pleased to have with me colleagues from the very prestigious Erasmus Mundus International Law, Global Security, Peace, and Development. But before I introduce them, let me do a brief introduction of myself. My name is Dr. Michael Muntade. I'm currently the founder of the Next Gen Global Frontier, and I'm happy to have this conversation, bringing together exceptional young leaders in international law and development, as well as global security, with people from the IIGSA to have this conversation. To start with this conversation, let me briefly introduce Susie. Susie is an Erasmus Mundus scholar. She'll be doing an analysis of this topic, but actually analyzing it from the geopolitics of this war and proposing possible outcomes and recommendations. And then we'll also move down to, on my right-hand side here, we have Razi Emenidin, who will be giving us an analysis of the threats and challenges posed by this war to the international security system. And thereafter, we move to Georgi, who will be giving us an analysis of the relevant international law mechanisms which have been explored by Ukraine during this war. And thereafter, then we move to the founder of this, of IIGSA, Samad, who will take the conversation further. And then again, we'll take it further to Desiree Di Marco, who would also be giving an analysis from the international relations perspective. And then we move down to Asham Azar. Tell me if I pronounce your name correctly, who would be giving the final talk on this, and we'll also have participation from the members of the audience. So without taking much of our time, I think we're good to start now. And I leave the floor to Susie to do a brief introduction of herself and the topic.
My name is Susie McAdam. I'm an Erasmus Mundus scholar at IIGSA. Before this, I did my undergraduate degree in law and politics at University of Glasgow. And I'm just wanting to talk to you a bit about the geopolitics of the war in Ukraine and what broader implications it will have for the world order as we currently know it. I think the geopolitics of the war are often very overlooked when we talk about why Russia is involved in Ukraine. And I think it has huge implications for the way that we currently conceive of world politics, and that will have implications for international law. So I'm just going to talk a bit about first the post-Soviet space and what's going on in Ukraine, and then talk about how that affects the broader context. So I think for Ukraine, Russia is both an asset and a liability. If Ukraine is influenced by Russia, it's extremely valuable. It's a consumer of Russian natural resources. It provides a warm seaport. And that's really important for Russia as it has very limited access to warm water seas. So it's important for trade. So there's a lot to be gained from having Ukraine under the influence of Russia. And we must not forget that Ukraine, despite having its own history, its own unique history, has also a history of being part of Imperial Russia and of the Soviet regime as well. But on the other hand, if Ukraine is not influenced by Russia, it is a liability. As we said, it's Russia's access to the sea, but it's also a way for people to invade Russia, and Russia can be very geographically insecure. Both Hitler and Napoleon tried to access Russia through Ukraine. It's the only border, the western border is one of Russia's most vulnerable because in the north you have the sea. In the east, Russia manages to control all that territory and seawater, and then in the south you have the mountains that provide some sort of barrier, but the west is easy access for anyone who would seek to threaten Russia. And so it's, from Putin's perspective, it's really important that Ukraine is under Russian influence, and it sees itself as the rightful hegemon of this post-Soviet space, and it sees Western expansion of Nato and any kind of Western interference. So I think it saw things like the 2014 revolution and ousting of Viktor Yanukovych as Western influence in Ukrainian elections, which were also influencing Russia's right to be the regional hegemon. So I think for Russia, it really is trying to seek dominance, reestablish its dominance in that region, and also hold off the future of any sort of Western influence in the region. So what does that mean on a global context moving out of the post-Soviet sphere? I think that it can provide, what we're seeing is that regional hegemons are moving away from the US. And I think it's clear to say that the US is in some sort of decline, in the sense of, I think what's most exemplifies this is China, India, Iran, and South Africa all abstained from condemning Russian aggression in the UN. In the Ukraine. And what that says is that the regional hegemons in other areas are less likely to align with the US and are less likely to call out an act of aggression when they see it. And I think China, especially, we must talk about, is not explicitly endorsing the war in Ukraine, but is also not condemning it. And this is in line with Chinese non-interventionist policy. But on the other hand, China also has a lot to gain from this. I think it could help establish China as the new world leader, in the sense of the more resources and the more Europe and Russia become divided over the issue of Ukraine and over Russia's future in the international order, the more China stands to benefit from that. And I think we can also potentially see the realignment of China-Russia relationship, which obviously was damaged during the communist period, could be repaired. Although, on the other hand, we have to see how the war plays out, because it also could be very problematic for China in terms of global trade and in terms of global stability. But China does stand a lot to gain from this war. And I think other countries who have strong economic and diplomatic relations with Russia, such as India, are also refusing to follow the US's line on this and call out this act of aggression. So on the other hand, we see that NATO and Europe will be potentially galvanized by this. I think certainly in the past decade, they've been kind of lost in terms of the future of NATO and its relevance. And I think now we're seeing a potential revival of that, although I think we must see how things go in France's elections, because obviously Marine Le Pen has been very aligned with Putin, and if she were to get elected in France, and also we have to see what the Germans do in terms of cutting off Russia from their dependence on Russian oil and gas. So I think there's a lot to be potentially coming out of this in terms of a division. I think there's a division and a strengthening of sides, I think, in a way, and it's sad in the sense of the kind of post-Cold War optimism, which we saw is becoming a lot more bleak. I think also for institutions like the UN and international law, I think, I don't know, I believe my colleague will talk a bit more on that later, but I worry that the UN will reach a stalemate as seen in the Cold War, in the sense of Russia and China creating some sort of block to prevent the UN carrying out its duty as a protector of global peace and security, and also justice. I think there could be a threat for that. So I think it's hard to make recommendations for the future. I think there's so much that's still uncertain, but what I know is that regardless of whether Russia's intervention in Ukraine goes as it has planned, I think there's definite shifts going on, and I think certainly from the Western perspective, I think they must be careful to make sure that they don't alienate those who they can still work with. I think the worst would be to create a global division, and I think we really need to make sure that certainly anti-Western sentiment, which is prevalent in many other areas of the world, is being addressed, and those grievances are being attuned and seen to, and but at the same time making sure that countries in the post-Soviet space who are vulnerable, like Georgia, like Finland, Sweden, are kind of protected from potential Russian aggression. Because as I said, Russia does see itself as the rightful regional hegemon, regardless of what other countries want for themselves. I think, yeah. So I think that's all I have to say on the matter. So I'll hand back over to Dami.
Wow, very interesting points. And I'd just like to raise some very, very important points. But before I do that, I see that our participants are very engaged and follow the very key points that she raised. One point that is particularly very important here is that Russia and China stand as superpowers trying to challenge the Western-led international order. And Susie just made us understand that this might be a challenge, moving forward, seeing as these two regimes are labeled as autocratic regimes, right? And, as next generation of leaders, we're thinking about this. What are the implications moving forward? She just mentioned that we do not want a situation where we have a global divide, where we're leaving out Russia and China as big powers in the UN permanent 5 members and their status generally. But generally, what do we think moving forward as next-gen people? What contributions do you think we can make? What lessons can we draw moving forward? I think it'd be very important to label that moving forward as young people, to just put that out for our audience now. Apart from the implications of what you've spoken about the division and what it looks like moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's why youth politics and meeting people from other countries is so important. I think certainly the program I'm on and meeting so many people from different regions of the world is so important to understand perspectives. I think we mustn't lose empathy, and we must learn from past mistakes in terms of never losing sense of the humanity and forgetting that in Russia there are real people living under difficult conditions, and regardless of whether they genuinely support Putin's regime or whether they feel coerced into supporting Putin's regime, there are still real people undergoing real challenges. And I think as global leaders and as the youth and as people who are able to, in this period of time, travel freely, most of us, and be able to meet different people, we mustn't lose sight of other people's humanity, and we must build bridges. I think that's the most important thing, is taking time to really understand each other, understand other people's perspectives, and then work with them to create initiatives which can help people regardless of where they come from or what sort of regime they've lived under. I think people, I think that's what it is. It's empathy and network building across the globe.
I think that's very fantastic. Building bridges beyond borders. I think it's very relevant, especially at a time like this, because when we're engaging on global issues in the very near future, we won't just be engaging as colleagues, we'll be engaging as friends. So I think the networks we try to create now will be relevant to how we engage to try to solve problems in the very near future. All right. Those are very important points from Susie, and now we can move further to the next on the agenda. We would be having our Dr. Desiree DeMarco, who is a non-resident research associate at IIGSA, to give us an analysis and lay the background for reorganizing the international community. Will there be a new role for the United States? Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Desiree DeMarco. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and I'm so happy to participate to this webinar. I'm so happy that Susie's statements are perfectly in line with mine, and I was pretty afraid of not, because here in Italy we don't have this perception that US is in decline, so people are kind of afraid of speaking like that. But I am I have this idea too. So I will briefly present my idea of declinism, of US declinism. I think that America appeared to be obsessed by decline since ever. And we can see that in the American society because real wages are falling, productivity growth is down, companies aren't competitive at all in global markets, the health system is deteriorating, cities are unsafe, schools are failing, and also the gap between rich and poor is widening. So pervasive is this preoccupation with decline that has given birth to its own school of thought also in the political field, but also in the academia, and it's called declinism, the idea that something is fundamentally wrong with the US economy and society, and until it's fixed, America will neither compete effectively in global markets nor provide an adequate standards of living for its citizens. But this idea of declinism was there also in the past. But even in previous moments of American vulnerability, Washington tried to reign supreme. Whatever moral or strategic challenge it faced, there was a sense of like political vibrancy matching with economy and military. But now I feel that something is changing, something is not the same. And among the international community, among the international order, states are feeling confused. There's so much confusion. And here in Europe, people don't like to talk so much about American decline, but the West, I think, partially knows that. Today, it's like today, EU feels trapped between an old world that no longer exists and a new one that has yet to fully take shape. And in the light of Ukraine, that is the topic of today's session, if we remember the Biden administration, but also the Bush, the Obama and the Trump administration saw the need to pivot their focus toward Asia and for Europe to do more for itself. And now Europeans too, they can see the tide of an American power turning. And in fact, Biden in his inaugural address said that the country, I'm quoting, lead not merely by the example of our power, but by the power of our example. And reading these lines today in the light of the Ukraine war, we can see, and I believe that this is partially true, because Biden succeeded in shepherd the West into like a unified position toward Ukraine, but America is not showing up. It's silent. So I'm asking, and I'm asking you guys also, why? I think that because the US power is in decline, it is still a superpower thanks to its allies, friends, economic tools like the US dollar and whatever, and even by its adversaries. And in other words, not Americans, but other countries, including rivals, keep the US as a superpower. They have done it like voluntarily, since the US has the desire to act globally, and any loss in its power would cause more losses in other countries. But however, particularly during the Trump administration, the US withdrew from the leadership of the like-minded countries, opening the way for China and Russia to be more active in the world affairs. However, Russia is like today in the Ukraine crisis is almost sure, I believe, that the US will not do anything other than condemn Russian atrocities, and US officials will like make statements similar to those of news correspondent, like instead of opposing really Russia's aggression, they choose to make predictions about when Russia will attack Ukraine, saying this is wrong, I will condemn, like make like, you know, a General Assembly discussion, but no more of that. And this, in theory, is very close to Mearsheimer thought, the American political analyst. And he says that the Ukraine war is a West fault. The United States and its European allies share most of the responsibility for the crisis, because the United States and its Western allies want to westernize Ukraine and make like a sort of buffer state between NATO and Russia. But Western leaders should acknowledge that Ukraine matters so much to Putin, also for the reason that Susie explained to us, economically, geopolitically, politically also. And this is not our field of action. This would not mean that the future of Ukraine government would have to be a pro-Russian or anti-NATO state. On the contrary, the goal of the international community, and in this way I go back to the initial topic, should be a sovereign Ukraine that falls in neither the Russian, neither the Western camp. So avoiding this ideological and political battle between West and Russia, anti-NATO, pro-Putin, and all of that. How to do that? To achieve these ends, of course, the United States and its allies should publicly rule out of NATO's expansion into, of course, both Georgia, because Georgia also is another issue, and Ukraine. And the West could, help fashion up an economy rescue plan for Ukraine that could be funded jointly by the EU, the International Monetary Fund, and Russia and the United States. And I believe that this could be a proposal that Moscow should welcome, given its interest in having a prosperous and stable Ukraine. So this is all I have to say, and I thank you for your time and for your consideration.
Your points, and particularly, let me just leave this, like the bottom line of your argument is that what role would you anticipate for the United States? You did mention that the United States is a bit silent. I don't know if I got that clearly, but I think for our participants here, I think they'd be really interested in what is the bottom line. The United States, what new role would you anticipate for the United States in this case? And would you anticipate a situation whereby other players would also have something to anticipate from this role of the United States, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I do believe that the current role of the US would be exactly the same as we are witnessing right now. I do not see political action or moving of the troops by the US in the field. I do believe that the US will remain politically, of course, active, condemning Russia's aggression in Ukraine, but I do not see military intervention in the field. In the near future, on the other hand, I do see NATO willing to reach his goal, and I do not see NATO stopping from, this goal of westernize other countries at the border with Russia, and also in the far future. But this is goes beyond the Ukraine war. I do see the military power of US reducing, and the political influence of US reducing even more. I do think that the US is a military superpower, yes, but as Susie said also, China, Iran, Pakistan, India, all these countries, all these states in the far future will become a very solid blockade facing US. And even if US still has, this soft power around the world and whatever, this blockade will be so strong that I do think that in the very, very, very far future, US power will decline.
Thank you very much. I think what I can take out from what you're saying is that there might be a time when there will be decline in the United States' global power status, and there will be an emergence of new powers across the world. Well, we'll watch out for how that unfolds. But ladies and gentlemen, moving swiftly on, Now, I will be inviting Razi Emenidine, who will be doing an analysis of the threats and challenges posed by this invasion to the international security system. We'll be talking about this in the context of the United Nations Security Council, security system, and the possible outcomes and solutions. You have the floor, Razi.
Yes, thank you, Damilola, and thank you everybody attending here, those in the room and those online. Special thanks to the Next Gen Global Frontier and the International Institute for Strategic Global Analysis for inviting me today. Regarding the threats and challenges posed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or as many, including myself, would like to frame it, President Putin and his oligarchy's invasion of Ukraine, as I believe you've mentioned, Susie, that it's an authoritarian regime which doesn't democratically thus represent the Russian people per se. And what challenges does it have to the international security system, and what are the possible outcomes and solutions, which I will discuss in two parts as follows. First of all, in terms of threats and challenges, we see the reemergence of interstate conflict, such an explicit all-out scale, which begs us to rethink the many foundations of the international security system that we've basically taken for granted for the last 30 years. For instance, I have a quote from The End of History, the original 1989 publication, where Fukuyama admitted, and I quote, "The end of history does not mean by any means, does not imply the end of international political conflict. However," and again I quote, "large-scale conflict must involve large states which are still caught in the grip of history, and those appear to be passing from the scene. Therefore, is this invasion just the rebirth of history, of the rebirth of the history of war, of large-scale interstate conflict, of large states which are still, for example, caught in the grip of the history of the Russian Tsardom or of the Soviet Union, where the Kremlin is perhaps feeling nostalgic to when Belarus translated to White Russia and Ukraine was allegedly part of Russia, though this is also historically debatable. Perhaps even the fears that were mentioned about NATO's expansion into Europe is perhaps a historical reflection caught in the Cold War or even pre-Cold War fears, back when the geopolitical area called as the European plains, as you mentioned, Susie, it was being a flat surface. It historically served as Russia's soft underbellies when it was invaded by Hitler or Napoleon. But in any case, regardless of whether those claims are justified, those fears are founded upon or not, basically this distrust in liberal international order and multilateralism and the existing collective security system is ironically a self-fulfilling prophecy. It promotes, as we are seeing, more European and Baltic states to seek NATO's protection. And apparently this is with good reason. Moreover, we are seeing the returning relevance of nuclear deterrence, or even, as one may say it, nuclear unilateral blackmail as a threat to international multilateralism. This is even more concerning to the international security order regarding the recent symptoms of the leader image irrationality portrayed within President Putin's public narrative and speech acts, where basically it's part of the Madman Act, where the Madman theory basically first applied to describe President Richard Nixon's foreign analysis. It analyzes how portraying such symptoms of irrationality is a bargaining bluff. It avoids provocation, fearing an unpredictable response. Again, we see the resurface of these tensions as a threat to the global security system, and perhaps a reemergence of the global security schism. Or it might be just a recipe for Russian international economic, financial, and diplomatical isolation, with, of course, as hinted, one very notable Chinese exception. And perhaps it's just too soon to judge. Anyways, moving to the invasion's outcomes, allow me to start by the predicted outcomes. From the Kremlin's perspective, military victory was overconfidently anticipated weeks ago. However, dozens opening day mistakes, which I won't go in detail with unless you ask me to, notoriously unreliable intelligence, outdated equipment, low morale, and even trouble in paradise back home, as I will explain later. All of this explains why the Russians' predicted outcome didn't tactically, militarily see through. As for the long-term strategic plan, it's unclear at this stage. Basically, President Zelensky is gaining popularity at the international security level by day and by social media. Everybody knows his standpoint. So an attack against him personally would just make him a martyr and further demonize Russian aggression. So I can't see the strategic outcome. Civilian resistance, on the other hand, is punching heavily above its weight in Ukraine, coupled with exposed Russian military as, may I say, a paper tiger. This all makes the long-term pacification virtually impossible. Basically, the question is on the long-term strategic goal from the Russian perspective in comparison to what you, Dr. Desiree, mentioned from the American perspective. So is from the Russian perspective, is Putin able or capable of affording to be stuck in a lengthy counter-insurgency operations for the decades to come, as we've seen, which fails and requires huge military, tactical, and strategical casualties and expenses, and etc. Moving on to the Ukrainian predicted narrative, it seems that the anticipated outcome is not simply trading blood for time, as one might have thought at the first days of the Ukrainian resistance. But basically, perhaps, as you hinted, it might be faith in the international community. Now, while the international community is multilaterally, naturally slow to respond in comparison to the unilateral Russian aggression, we are starting to see how vigorous its potential is across diplomatic, economic, financial, banking, and many other sectors, even if they didn't, as perhaps many desire, military intervention in a direct way. In addition, we are seeing unprecedented European mobilization outside American security dependency, which further enhances NATO with Germany, as we were discussing. It announced its commitment to cross the 2% GDP threshold on defense spending. And historically neutral states, again, are considering joining NATO, again, perhaps with good reason. So a steadily assembling and rallying, figuratively speaking, military international front. Basically, we're starting to see how this dichotomy might not work well in on the long run for Russia. And we're starting to see how Russia is the one running on borrowed time and trading blood for time, not the other way around, not Ukrainian resistance. Again, perhaps it's all speculations that are being given too soon to be precise enough. As for the hardest assumptions, the long-term strategic solutions outside the strict military predictions, basically, it's hard to say what our solution would be, but I can't stress enough the importance of the instruments of international law, because international law was never drafted to accommodate our convenience with multilateral perhaps acknowledgement of driving licenses, but it is for exactly these particular sets of circumstances that it evolved throughout history. But this is all, I think, will be further discussed by my colleague Georgi. So I will perhaps give a different international relations perspective, and in particular, the democratic peace theory. This theory goes all the way back to Immanuel Kant, and it's founded upon the idea that democracy are constantly that democracies are constantly constrained by its voting population. And while we saw that Putin's approval ratings back in 2014 climax, it's 98, it's 89% following Crimea's annexation. This theory would suggest that the public opinion would tend to disapprove an all-out war, basically because it involves human casualties, it involves resource drains, drafts, and conscriptions. Those are methods extremely unpopular, where, for example, the Russian army is 25% conscripted in comparison with the 100% voluntary US army, as you were, like, for example, hinting about the US military capabilities, for instance. This unpopularity would be exacerbated by the current technology through social media, networking, and open source reporting, which are giving for example, a current flow of the horrors of war, a very traumatizing experience, and even the very tactically and strategically effective Ukrainian position of giving the Russian soldiers the opportunity to call back home, this secondhand trauma and everything else. It just shows how the Ukrainian people must at some point stand up and face their leaders, and perhaps the solution would be inside Russia, not externally. I hope the best for the Ukrainian people, and they be strong and not lose hope. And thank you again for your attention.
Fantastic. Those were very, very loaded points raised by Razi. But just to leave our audience with a particular points that they can go on with today. You mentioned the fact that international law is created for a time like this.
Exactly.
For a time like this, right? And we're a time where the international security system is under pressure. It's being tested by Russia. It's been a big power, and it's being supported by China. All right. So where should we run to? I think that's the question for the ordinary man. Where do we run to if the United Nations Security Council can find a solution to this? I understand that Russia was suspended from the United Nations Human Rights Council, but what other organizations do we run to as, like, a refugee point when there is a war like this? International law is created to respond to situations like this. Where else do we run to? What if you can have some 1 or 2 points to leave our audience with?
So basically, I think what we are first running to is the international judicial organizations, which I won't dig deep into them because I was talking with Georgi about those judicial mechanisms, and I believe he will be discussing that. Where we would be also running to, let's start by regional organizations, say the Venice Convention, formerly the Council of Europe, was expelled. Russia was expelled from the Council of Europe, and Belarus's membership was suspended. We're seeing other international organizations, perhaps at the global scale, even now with the rise of multinational corporations, let's say the international trade system, the international banking system. You see the suspending Russia from SWIFT, from the SWIFT banking system was one of the most severe and fastest responses to or sanctions imposed upon a nation, I think, in the modern history. So all these factors combined would perhaps overshadow the traditional military intervention that would uphold international law.
I think that's very, very interesting. And mentioning about sanctions and from...
I have this question. Can I ask?
Okay, we have a section for questions. All right, thank you very much. Please reserve the question. We'll also come back to our audience at home. If you have questions for our speakers, I think we'll be, giving each question to each speaker after that. But the bottom line of what Razi has said is that we're not only relying on the United Nations Security Council system as a refugee point to solving this problem. We're also seeing responses from other organizations, from the World Trade Organization, and from the private sector, the civil society, as an international community as a whole. All right, so moving forward, I'll be welcoming Salman Al-Khan, who was the founder of IIGSA, to enlighten us on the competing narratives of the Ukrainian crisis. And here is going to ask the question: did the West breach Russian threshold? Mr. Samad, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Demi. I'm so pleased to be a part of this esteemed panel. Much has been covered by Razi, by Desiree, and of course by Susie. But I'll try to come up with a few points that they did not cover. So I'll start with the Mishaimus debate, which the West is particularly antagonist about. How he portrayed how the West is responsible for Russian invasion of Ukraine. But if we go back to the history and we see in the recent past the developments which occurred around the border of Russia and the western side, so we see that in Bucharest summit, when President Bush announced that they would be asking Ukraine to join NATO and become a member, it was a breach of red flag for the Russians. Then also, if we fast forward to today's contemporary scenario, we see that many of the Western countries, including Germany, including France, and the US, they have been selling weapons. They have been giving out trainings and conducting joint exercises with Ukraine, which obviously gives a image that they are developing that country's military capabilities. And when the country is of such a strategic location, at such a strategic location, and of such a flashpoint for Russia, so obviously we would see that how the Russians would basically react. And then now, as Desiree mentioned, that they have asked the Western governments, they have asked Ukraine to become a buffer state between the NATO and the Russian side. So it obviously gives out an image that the Western governments want Ukraine to become a part of NATO and obviously deter Russia directly. Then we also see that Ukraine has been labeled that it has been spreading separatists which operate from Ukraine and into they launch attack into Russia as well. And then again, if we come to the publicly, you can say, highlighted notion that Putin's revanchist approach, it has led Putin to basically attack or invade Ukraine. So I have a slight difference of opinion from everyone here who have said that it was Putin's mind that compelled him to go for this, because in 2010, when he was asked about how he feels about Ukraine or the former Soviet Union's territories, so he said, and I quote, "Whoever does not miss the Soviet Union has no heart. Whoever wants it back has no brain." So it is debatable that actions are not like what the words are, but still we have to see that in the context of Ukraine, their foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, he has denied that the claims of West and Ukraine that Putin has adopted a revanchist approach. However, if we see that if this invasion is to be judged in a security studies prism, then we can see that offensive defense theory, it is totally applicable on this scenario, because we see that with the buildup of Ukrainian military, Russia sees it as a threat, and it is basically deterring it by a first-hand response because it considers it to be a threat to its national security. And as Razi mentioned, that democratic peace theory would have been applied if Russia was a democratic country. But I fear that it's not applicable to each and every country, because if you see different conflict zones around the world, especially in South Asia, and we talk about Pakistan and India, both the countries, they are democratic countries, but we fail to understand the concept of democratic peace theory. So I think it won't be applicable to each and every aspect of this war. And now, if I move forward to the Western approach to this conflict, they have been accusing Putin of using chemical weapons, biological weapons against as a threat against the Ukrainians and the West to stop this equipping of Ukrainians. And they basically want to meet the Russian aggression, not through military means right now, but through economic means. They want to sanction them so that the will of the country is basically break down and ultimately lead towards the removal of Mr. Putin from his office. But obviously, this narrative is driven by moral outrage that Russian aggression is not justified, and obviously, it's another debate of just or unjust war. But as Susie mentioned in the start, that the geographical means to invade Russia, they have been a very critical point when it comes to Ukraine as a strategic position. But again, I will differ from it because in the north, things have changed drastically. With the climate change effect, there have been, you can say, military occupations in different zones. Both Russia and the US, they have contended the northern front as well. They have sent their navies. They are militarizing the zones. So I think that this region was to become a warfighting zone because of two reasons. And again, Putin is not looking for occupying the whole Ukraine, as per my analysis, because he wants the strategic locations, the key choke points of Ukraine, to be under his, you can say, control, especially the eastern border of Ukraine and the region around in and around Crimea, because they serve as the gateways to Russian territories, and he is more oblivious in this terms that he wants to occupy them. Now coming to Russian rebuttal on this, they have stated that the Bucharest summit, in which the Ukrainian acceptance to NATO was announced, that was the first triggering point for us. Then the US support for uprising of Viktor Yanukovych. It was followed by the President Trump's decision in 2017 to sell defensive weapons to Ukraine and place them around Crimea in Donbas region, and then again the Black Sea naval exercises that were conducted by US and Ukraine in 2021. Again, in November of that very year, they also signed a charter which was termed as US-Ukraine Charter on Strategic Partnership. So when you say that the West, or especially the US, is equipping a country that is, as highlighted by Razi, is a soft underbelly of Russia, so would you expect it to not respond and to see this, you can say, enhancement of strategic ties as a defensive upgradation of a country? So I think it would not be the place when you are, as a strategic thinker, or standing in a place when different on different fronts and at different levels, you are being faced by a constant threat in the form of US or the Westerns. So you would obviously react back. Now coming to multipolarity, I think multipolarity also has played a wide role in this conflict, if not triggering, but you can say intensifying at the moment, because the emergence of new bloc politics, in which China-Russia bloc is an emergent one, with also Middle Eastern countries and South Asian countries. They're also very keen to join this bloc. If I quote Saudi Arabia, it has highlighted that it might be tilting towards the Russian side. I have seen this. I have just concluded a report on this very phenomena, that how Saudi Arabia is drifting away from the US, not in totality, but obviously to a larger extent. Then Pakistan, also we stayed a bit neutral in the start initially, but then we have had to choose sides between Russia or the West because of peer pressure. Turkey has also vouched for, you can say, the approach which was led by Putin at the start, but then things changed. But China right now has been a very static and steadfast partner of Russia in this regard. India has also India wasn't able to you can say stand to its point where it initially said that they would be supporting the Russians because they have called off different arms deals, which I think Hashim would be highlighting in his talk. And I think this notion of multipolarity, or the emergence of multipolarity, not only on strategic side, but obviously on geoeconomic side, has been playing a massive role in triggering this conflict. I also had this point to discuss about the regime change, but because of a few things, I think that would go towards the question answer session. Rather, I would be placing a focus on a bit more controversial point, that is the use of military industry complexes in this crisis. I will quote the Greg Hayes, who is the CEO of Raytheon Technologies, and they're one of the biggest military suppliers to the U.S. government. And when the conflict between Ukraine and Russia was in the start, he said that it would be a lucrative hotspot for the businesses of US military contractors. Afterwards, when the conflict erupted and it snowballed, he said that post-conflict scenarios, they not only increase the national security spendings in and around Europe, but Biden administration would also spend a lot into this. So I think if we relate it to the military industrial complexes of different countries who are the major stakeholders in this particular conflict, we would see how they are benefiting from this, because and I will connect it with the withdrawal of US from anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002, and obviously the intermediate range nuclear forces treaty in 2019. So this shows that the rearmament programs of different countries, they have been increased. I'll again quote Germany and France. They have revisited their approach towards the military, and they are now increasing their budgets of military rearmament around 2 to 4% per year. So this also places a critical load when you say the conflict at a larger picture, through a larger lens, that countries are not only, some countries, obviously, they are benefiting from this conflict. And one thing more, which the Raytheon Technologies CEO, he highlighted, that these weapons, they are being tested in the battlefield right now, and in future they would be sold to the Middle Eastern market as well. So this proves that there is a big chance that this crisis would be elongated to a long-term war or a long-term conflict zone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Samad, for the very important points that you've raised. And I'd just like you to give us a very I don't want to call it a punchline, but just give us one sentence for all that you've said. From all that I understood that you've said, I don't think you're defending Russia in this context, right? And I also understand that from all that we can draw out of this now, what it means is that superpower countries tend to, they see an economic side to this war, right? And try to see the market opportunity and try to, provide some sort of supply for that. While I'll be speaking briefly on that in terms of what implication it has for development, I'd like you to tell our audience what your own position is on this topic with respect to the competing narratives.
Well, yeah, to be very clear, I'm not defending what Russia is doing in Ukraine. I just implied to what the reasons were for the particular invasion, that it is said that the revanchist approach that was followed by President Putin to invade and occupy Ukraine. But people give out sweeping statements in this regard, and though they don't see or analyze what the ground realities or what the indicators of the conflict or of the event are. So that was my point, that it's not entirely the fault of Russia when it invaded Ukraine, but there have been confrontational scenarios that were led or promoted by the Western governments and Western countries in particular. When it comes to this point of economy or geoeconomics, I am implying to the benefiting of military industrial complexes, that many countries who have big markets, who have been involved in this conflict, they have tried, they have tested their weapons in other conflict zones as well. Let me give you the example of Afghanistan, of Syria, of you can say Iraq. These all conflict zones, they were test beds for prototype weapons, and many of the equipment that are now being used or now being inducted by different militaries. So I think we can correlate this particular phenomena to many of the countries whose military industry complexes are a backbone for their economy.
Okay, thank you very much. That is much clearer for our audience. Now we move swiftly on to Georgi, who will be giving us an analysis of the relevance of international law mechanisms in the Russia-Ukraine war. The floor is yours, Georgi.
Thank you very much, Dami, for inviting me to this very interesting roundtable. I think all the points that have been mentioned are very relevant to the current situation that is unfolding in Ukraine, unfortunately. And as you have mostly covered the political aspects and international relations aspects of this issue, I will try to focus on more on the legal mechanisms at play that is relevant and applicable to the current situation. Before doing that, I just wanted to briefly mention, I personally, for instance, do not share the position that the West shares the responsibility for what is going on in Ukraine. And the reason, primarily, there are multiple reasons for that, but one of the major reasons is that when there is discussion about the issue of Ukraine or generally of the conflicts, the agency and the opinions of smaller states are ignored. So it is always considered within the context of East-West relations and these big powers clashing with one another, but sometimes they neglect the relevance and the position of smaller states. So when it comes to, for instance, Nato expansion into Eastern Europe, this is should not be understood, in my opinion, as Western countries trying to interfere within Russia's strategic interest, but rather as those smaller states, such as Ukraine or Georgia or Baltic states that became members of the NATO, it's their own will to become parts of the NATO as an organization, because they are well aware of the Russia's revisionist and imperialist policies that they have faced for hundreds of years. The history doesn't start necessarily in the post-1990 period. You have 200 years of history of Russian imperialism that these states, including Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, the states in the Baltic, Eastern European states, they have suffered. So they have legitimate concerns that with regard to their security. And they believe that their security can only be guaranteed with the help of being part of NATO in this case. Therefore, I don't think that necessarily here that the West is to blame for it, that the West is trying to interfere in Russia's strategic interests, but rather it is supporting the free will of those states to become part of the Western liberal international order. As regards the point that I want to make today is that given the context of this war, lots of political, economical aspects are covered, and sometimes these legal aspects are ignored. And I just wanted to mention what is the strategy of a small country such as Ukraine in terms of, it's not a very small country, but it's not a great power, a big power. What is the strategy of Ukraine in order to oppose the Russian aggression in parallel with the military aspects of fierce resistance that the Ukrainian people are demonstrating in this war? What kind of mechanisms come at play? And this reminds me of the situation that happened back in my country in Georgia in 2008 when we faced Russian aggression. In addition to the self-defense that was initiated by Georgia in 2008, Georgia also availed of different international legal mechanisms as a way of mobilizing international community and demonstrating that law and justice was on Georgia's side as such. Therefore, when it comes to the current situation, and when generally a armed conflict of such scale happens, small countries try to use international courts and tribunals and as a way of putting forward their position and demonstrating that they're committed to the principles of peaceful settlement of disputes. So Ukraine, in this case, quickly submitted several different applications in different international courts. And three of them are of particular importance when it comes to the relevance of international legal mechanisms. And that is that Ukraine submitted an application to the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention of 1948, in which it alleges, Ukraine argues that Russia falsely claims that genocide happened in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, that these claims are unfounded, and therefore there is no legal justification for the military aggression that is ongoing currently in Ukraine. So this has its own reasons why Ukraine chose this position, was to refute Russia's arguments. It's part of informational warfare that is conducted. It tries to expose Russia's illegal war against a victim state, and tries to therefore gain the support of international community as a responsible actor, trying to use international legal mechanisms for peaceful settlement of disputes. Another important aspect of this so-called, the concept sometimes referred to as lawfare or legal warfare, is that to establish, of course, the legal responsibility of the Russian Federation and therefore use it, the decisions of these courts, for its diplomatic efforts of pressuring Russia, gaining the support of international community, and continuing sanctions on the Russian Federation. In addition to the ICJ, there is important developments currently ongoing in the International Criminal Court, and we have seen an unprecedented group referrals of 41 countries referring to the ICC to investigate the current crimes taking place daily in Ukraine. This is so the problem here is that given the fact that Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute, neither Ukraine is a party to the Rome Statute, but Ukraine has has an ad hoc declaration that is submitted to the ICC and has accepted the ICC jurisdiction. However, although the ICC can therefore investigate crimes such as war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide that is taking place in Ukraine, it lacks jurisdiction when it comes to the crime of aggression. Because in order for the ICC to investigate the crime of aggression in Ukraine, it needs to have that both countries, Ukraine and Russia, to be full parties of the Rome Statute, which they are not. So there are different kinds of ideas of what to do in this case, what can be done in order to hold Russian leadership accountable for the crime of aggression, because as you know, the crime of aggression is a leadership crime. So it's a shortcut to the people that are in charge of the Russia's military campaign in Ukraine. They are in control of this military campaign. And some of the ideas that have been put forward was to, for instance, to establish a separate special military tribunal, something along the lines of the Nuremberg Tribunal in 1945. However, there are problems with respect and challenges with respect to how this tribunal will proceed or will work. One of the ideas was that given that Russia is on the Security Council, it can block any attempts of creating a tribunal by the Security Council. So the idea is that United Nations General Assembly, through Uniting for Peace resolution, advocates for the creation of a special tribunal. There's also an idea of creating a hybrid tribunal, such as along the lines of extraordinary chambers of Cambodia or a special court of Sierra Leone, with an agreement between Ukraine and the UN. Of course, these are just attempts currently underway in order to hold Russia accountable for its crimes, for its transgressions of international law. The actual enforcement mechanisms, as you are well aware, are lacking in international law. So ultimately, what it comes down to is that the attempts that Ukraine is currently pursuing on international plane, it is part of its strategy, wider diplomatic strategy, to demonstrate that it is committed to this peaceful settlement of disputes, that it wants to continue to receive the continuing support of the international community, and showcase that it is a victim of Russian aggression. And international community needs to continue pressuring on the aggressor. So this is just pretty much what I wanted to talk about. If you have any further questions, I will please respond.
That's very fantastic. And I see Samad also clapping with his virtual hand. Sister, that's very fantastic point raised by Georgi. And at this point, seeing as we have a lot of time being spent, I think it'd be very good to go to the very last speaker for the day and reserve all the questions for participants in the room and at home. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome the very last speaker for the day, Mr. Shem Zafar, who is a research officer at IIGSA. We'll be doing an analysis of the Ukrainian crisis, Western engagement, and the lessons for the international community. You have the floor, Mr. Shem.
First of all, thank you, Mr. Gundutade, for giving me an opportunity to speak here. It's a real privilege. So to clarify, for the purposes of today's discussion, I'm going to be limiting the ambit of engagement to the theater of direct military interventions or engagements. To begin with, most Western engagements post the Second World War were in the Third World. Thus, the Western theater wasn't directly affected, so to say. Following the 50-odd years after the Second World War, most engagements were in the context of the Cold War. We have Korea, we have Vietnam, we have the Soviet-Afghan War, and South America to a certain degree as well. Post the fall of the Soviet Union, the reason to tear for engagement changed to combating terrorism and extremism. And in this new era of engagement, there was a particular focus on the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Northern Africa. Western engagements in the past 20 years included the Gulf War, the Chechen conflict, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan, of course, Libya, and Syria, to give a few examples. So how has the style of engagement changed? So before I move on here, I'd first like to take the liberty to state that it is indeed very distasteful to compare conflicts of the recent past in terms of civilian lives lost. For killing of civilians is a tragedy and must be condemned unequivocally. However, to do a comparative analysis of regional military engagements, the intensity of conflicts in the Middle East saw a much more brutal type of warfare. Carpet bombings, deadly drone strikes, killer capture raids, which were usually done in the night. I'm primarily focusing here on Iraq and Afghanistan. And to give you guys an example, maybe of the sort of brutality that was seen here, we can just look at the casualty figures from the Pak Afghan theater and Iraq. In Pakistan and Afghanistan, we lost more than 71,000 civilians, and 100,000 Iraqi civilians were lost in Iraq. So when we talk about recent Russian invasions compared to the military adventures of the West, we see a much more retaliatory behavior. Russia, rightly or wrongly, sees her national security at risk with the prospects of Ukraine falling in the Western camp. And there exists a very real fear in Russian policymakers of strategic depth Russia might lose in such a scenario. I believe Ms. McAdam and Mr. Samuel Khan talked about this earlier. So if we compare this line of argument with the role of the United States, NATO, and other key allies, they've had a much more interventionist approach. Iraq is an excellent example of this, where the said country did not necessarily pose a direct threat to the intervening powers. So moving on, how is the international community being affected? So the Russian invasion of Ukraine is perhaps the biggest military engagement in Europe since the Second World War. Thus, the fallout of the conflict can be felt not just in Europe, but all over the world. Just to give you a few examples, Russia and Ukraine together amount to 29% of the world's wheat supply. And by virtue of the supply chain being disrupted of a very, very major staple crop, we can of course understand the sort of implications that it has. Another good example would be the overland trade between China and Europe. In 2021 alone, rail operators ran more than 1,200 freight trains per month between China and Europe, transporting almost 1.5 million containers. In light of many routes traversing both Russian and Ukrainian territory, there exists a great sense of insecurity for transporters, thus affecting the global supply chain. Moving on, we have to talk about the impact it has had on the people. Other than the people who have lost their lives, there have been more than 4 million refugees, and scores more is displaced internally in Ukraine. As per UNHRC reports, most of them have turned to neighboring countries like Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Moldova, thus putting an economic pressure on the host countries themselves. Furthermore, if the conflict prolongs, one may also expect a rise in insecurity among European nations, and this may usher in a new arms buildup in Europe, which is of course very, very threatening and very, very scary for the rest of the world. Moving on, I'd like to again reiterate that crisis zones can't be compared. However, it must be noted that the recent events in Ukraine overshadowed post withdrawal of Afghanistan, which has put the whole region in a state of massive crisis. Here I'm particularly focusing on Afghanistan and Pakistan, and to a certain degree, Central Asia as well. The whole region has become a hotbed for non-state actors, regional and extra-regional players, to reactivate their operations, and in many cases, with malicious intent. In Afghanistan, we see the rise of the Islamic State Khorasan province, Al-Qaeda, and the TTP is also resurfacing to fill in the vacuum created by the hasty American withdrawal. Pakistan, for example, has seen a sharp increase in terror attacks originating across the border, 42% to be precise in 2021, and scores of deadly attacks in 2022, and which have recently also forced Pakistan to respond and carry out cross-border airstrikes. China and other regional countries may also be emboldened to flex their military might. China, in the context of Taiwan, has been steadily testing Taiwanese patience by constantly rotating Navy warships and conducting routine air sorties. Moving on, in contrast to earlier conflicts in the region where the NATO was solely led by one power, in response to the Ukraine conflict, we see an array of different responses from regional players. India, for example, initially showed great restraint in condemning Russian actions directly. She abstained from 3 resolutions on the subject and refused to join the democratic coalition against Russia led by the US. And furthermore, reiterated its right to keep its doors open when it came to the domain of energy cooperation. However, recently, it's interesting to note that India has not stood firm with a long-standing strategic partner and has drifted towards the US, in part to enhance its military requirements and to avoid the threat of sanctions from the US. India sees this as a means to counter China, which is becoming its major ally in the region. Most recently, India pulled out from a deal to acquire 21 MiG-29 jets from Russia and also withdrew from buying 48 M17 helicopters from Russia. On the other hand, similarly, Pakistan has been trying to get rid of its long-standing precedent of supporting the US in such a scenario and has opted for neutrality, stating the country does not want to play camp politics as was done in the past. Notably, like India, Pakistan abstained from condemning Russia in the UN, and interestingly, the former Prime Minister Imran Khan also visited Russia just as the military engagement began, but that was more to do with coincidence. It is also, however, we have to note here that the policy of neutrality in Pakistan's context might not last, as there's a new government in power that just came in a few weeks ago, which is looking for more favorable ties with the West, particularly the US. Moving on, we can talk about the Middle East. This was something Mr. Samad Ali Khan elaborated in detail. The Middle East in general, however, has had a very flavorless response. Qatar, for example, reiterated how the issue needs to be de-escalated and furthermore also declined to redirect gas supplies to Europe to replace Russian gas supplies to Europe. Saudi Arabia and the UAE abstained to condemn Russia on the international stage. And it seems as if the traditional sway the United States has had over Middle Eastern foreign policy is slowly but surely drifting away. China, on the other hand, has been the only country that has stood firm when it comes to supporting Russia when it comes to the Ukrainian crisis. So to conclude, I'd like to present my own personal analysis, which is partly also inspired by the likes of Pravin Swani, where I believe this crisis will start reorganizing international alliances into 2 broad camps, as no regional player, in my opinion, has the might to go its own ways. Sure, we are seeing a trend of taking your own stance. However, it wouldn't be wrong to predict that most players will pick a side, so to say, and the international order will move towards bipolarity in the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful submission, Hashim. And now we leave the floor to our participant at home and those right here for questions to the speakers or contributions generally before we round off this roundtable.
I have several questions. I think first question can be answered by all of the speakers, and the last question, I think, is more for the Georgi, who spoke about the tribunals, judicial tribunals, and new ways to solve this today's topic. First of my question is, you kind of all mentioned the international relations theories, and I was interested what importance does it have on today's events, and if coming from the international relations theories, was it feasible what has happened in 21st of February, I think, this year by Russia? Was it feasible coming from the international relations theories? And if it was, could it have been done something to avoid what happened? My first question would be this, and my second question is, Georgi mentioned the creating new tribunal, and I was interested, particularly in your opinion, do you think that this is effective, or do you think that this will be another tribunal and decision which cannot be enforced, and is it the same thing, or is it something new, and is it beneficial, and if so, in what matters? And also, could it affect the previous crimes of aggressions committed by Russia, as in 2014 Crimea and also in 2018 Georgia? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we can have other questions before we answer.
I can start with the last question,
right,
and then so as regards the creation of a new possible special tribunal for the crime of aggression. So again, the reason why such a necessity exists is because of the limited jurisdictional scope of the International Criminal Court and fragmented nature for the prosecution of the crime of aggression that exists. So there is International Criminal Court which has jurisdiction over the crime of aggression, but it has limited the jurisdiction only to the state parties that have recognized the aggression amendments. And given that Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute, it cannot exercise such a jurisdiction. That is why it has been proposed that a special military tribunal may be a solution to this problem. I think that it is possible to create such a special tribunal. It can be created with the consent of both Ukraine and the United Nations General Assembly, which would give it legitimacy, because generally the creation of international tribunal requires the legitimacy of the international community. So if the United Nations General Assembly, as we saw when it comes to the United for Peace resolution just several weeks ago that was adopted condemning the Russian aggression in Ukraine, around 146 states voted for it in favor of that. So if something along these lines happens and those states support the creation of a tribunal, it is possible. As regards the effectiveness of this tribunal, again, as I mentioned, there is no international military police force that can gain custody of the leadership of the Russian Federation or individuals that are responsible for the crimes that are committed in Ukraine. However, as you know, if there are arrest warrants issued by this tribunal or generally by the ICC when it comes to war crimes or crimes against humanity, then states will have an obligation to surrender those individuals if they end up on the territory of those countries. So it means that there will be a continuing pressure on the Russian Federation when it comes to handing over of the people responsible for these crimes. So I think it is important in this context, because otherwise it will, such an act of aggression, it means that it will go unpunished. And therefore it is important at least to create such a tribunal or a hybrid tribunal. I mean, there are different models that have been suggested. So it, of course, requires very exhaustive analysis of the pros and cons of creating such a tribunal. Yeah, and as regards the, just to briefly mention about the IR theories. So when it comes to IR theories, they can, to some extent, assess the situation post factum. However, it is hard to predict how the events will unfold in the nearest future based on those theories. It is very difficult. So it's just it's possible to take certain aspects of different theories and using those certain aspects to somehow predict, but I don't think that it's entirely possible to make such predictions.
All right, thank you. Susie?
I think, yeah, just to add about IR theories, I think the IR theories have utility in trying to understand mindsets. And so I think, Mr. Khan, you talked about offensive defensive realism, is that right? And I think that is the best way to try and understand generally how the Kremlin views its policy, views its own policy. They definitely take a more realist approach to international relations, and understanding that, you can see why they would take something like NATO expansion, which from a liberal perspective, which is what Razi was coming more from, you can see from a liberal perspective, the expansion of NATO was about creating, harmony. It was about expanding, bringing more people into the fold. Some would say even bringing them into Western hegemony. But from the Russian perspective, you can see why that was inherently threatening. And I think the problem with NATO is that its raison d'etre was to be oppositional to Russia, and so its continuation, instead of creating a more inclusive and collective security organization, can be seen as very flawed. And I think Mearsheimer's argument, I think, has had a lot of influence in Western policy circles and Western analysis, in terms of his argument that NATO expansion has been the cause of all of this. However, I think, like I say, you have to also, just to kind of counter that, you have to understand also the Russian understanding of international relations, which, like I say, is more realist and does see itself more as able to influence Ukraine. It's able to try and take action in spaces that it sees as rightfully theirs, and you can see why, even if NATO was never going to be an explicit aggressor to Russia, Russia would always perceive it in that way. So I think that's, for me, just to summarize, that's the value of IR theories, is that how we can understand countries and mindsets in the international community, and understanding that Russia has a more realist approach to international relations can help us understand how we can engage with Russian policymakers, with the Kremlin going forward.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now we leave it to other participants in the room. If you have any questions or contributions to make, I think now is a good time. Okay, so this question is directed to Ashim. You've concluded that the international shift will move toward bipolarity. Would that be a shared Eastern hegemony between Russia and China, or is it a multipolarity, a possibility between the three? I think Rashim would have to brainstorm on that, and I welcome Tamrad if you have any questions or comments at this point.
Yeah, I would like to ask the fellow scholars from your institute that, do you think that America, it would be placing sanctions on India and specifically China under its IIGSA Act, which states that any of the country which is doing business or which is doing economic relations with a country that is an aggressor and is directly threatening the American interest would be sanctioned by America. And the act's name is Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act.
Yes, if anyone would like to answer that, but now I think I'll leave the floor to Ashim to respond to that question.
Thank you so much. I honestly believe that it's going to be China is going to be like specifically leading one particular camp, particularly because of the fact that it is so ahead of the others, particularly Russia, when it comes to its economic strategies, its economic impact on the world, and specifically by virtue of its fast military modernization. Russia is, of course, a contender. However, it is lagging behind when it comes to economic the economic footprint it has. So yeah, I think it's going to be two poles, and the reason I believe this theory is multipolarity seems to does not really guarantee stability. for this, there are going to be multiple poles which are going to be fighting for supremacy or more a bigger part of the pie, whereas two poles will basically secure a better sense of security, as we saw to a certain degree during the Cold War. We didn't really have a war to end all wars, so to say.
I think regarding, are you unmuted? I think regarding the counter-Americans adversaries through Sanctions Act, or basically, let's be more general, more broad on this topic. The US Congress initiated acts and sanctions upon Russia, and perhaps also like Iran and other states for compliance or non-compliance with international law from a US perspective. And again, this is just analysis at this point, perhaps too early. Of course, those are increasingly relevant, and the Russian economy perhaps would be affected by this, as well as all others. But from my perspective, I see that the international unity, as you are seeing, the multipolarity and the international direction towards countering these challenges to security, are taking a more unitary approach through international organizations, through regional organizations, even through, I think you mentioned, through the civil society, through social media. All this unity, I think, will have a much more massive impact than the mere acts taken by perhaps the US or a single state on that matter. I think that will be the heaviest of all sanctions from my perspective.
Okay, thank you very much, Razi. I think one thing that we all agree today is that, for instance, the Next Gen Global Frontier is focused on international development. But then again, we recognize that we cannot contribute to international development without international security. A lot of these concepts work together, all right? And just thinking about the sustainability impact of Russia-Ukraine war, Ashim mentioned a lot of impact on the global economy and impact on progress towards sustainability. I think I also saw a report by the International Monetary Fund putting the reconstruction cost for Ukraine up to $500 billion. That's a lot. And while there might be a lot of arguments as relating to whether or not Ukraine is going to win the war, or whether or not, as in actual essence, there are going to be winners or losers in this war, we need to also think about the fact that Ukraine would have to be reconstructed. That is going to take a lot of money. And, as you also mentioned, a surge in refugee crisis to other countries across Europe. I think this is a lot of pressure. And I think from a sustainability perspective, I don't know if anyone in the room, maybe Grace, would have a point to jump on this, or anybody at all. I think this might also be a time for us to rethink sustainable partnership, because we're thinking about a point where we need to have a kind of trusted and reliable partnership and know where the partnership is coming from if we truly want to advance the goals. All right, now we're talking about international security, what we can do as young people. Susie has mentioned the fact that we need to build bridges beyond borders. Razi has made mention of the opportunities and threats to the international security system and why we can still rely on the private sector and the civil society and other multilateral organizations in terms of responding to these international security challenges. Georgi has also mentioned the legal mechanisms available in this regard. I think at this point we're good to go, but I would like to introduce one or two questions from our participants who submitted questions online. Otherwise, if we all agree that we don't take the questions, then we can all say goodbye and take the final pictures and move. All right, but I think they're very, very important questions. The first one for anybody from the IIGSA or from at home or right here in the room, if you want to give an attempt at this. With regards to legal mechanisms, are ceasefire treaties such as the Minsk Agreement still relevant to keeping world peace? I think Georgi might want to answer this. And next question here says that, what is the take on leveraging big technology as a mechanism for solving situations like this? And is a decentralized technology ecosystem a positive or negative situation to solving a situation like this, I guess? Again, will the war result in change in the international balance of power? I think Hashim might want to answer this. What is needed to be done by the Ukrainian people to get military support from other world power countries? I think we've probably answered this some way, somehow, or if anyone wants to jump on that. What are the physical efforts to be put in place that would never make any country in the world disregard respect for humanity? Oh my God. Okay, I think what the person is trying to say is what efforts will be put together to ensure that no country violates international law principles as relating to avoiding war in the future. I think that's what it is. So we can have our speakers jump on the questions very quickly. We have the closing remarks by Samad, and we have final pictures, and we can. So thank you.
Okay, so I think I'll touch upon the question regarding the relevance of Minsk agreement and what is the current situation. So I think that Minsk agreement has in large part lost its meaning or its value after the invasion was commenced by Russia. What is happening right now is that Ukraine is requiring security guarantees. So it requires a new system of international or regional security. In particular, given the fact that Ukraine didn't become member of NATO, and of course the reasoning behind that is that the West were reluctant to admit Ukraine as a member, and particularly after the Russian invasion, that the possibility of this happening is, of course, a very distant future. So what Ukraine is asking is to create something, a mechanism similar with the Article 5 guarantees that is given in NATO, in which a structure which includes the members of the Security Council, and in addition, other key players such as Germany, Poland, and UK, of course, United States, and even Russia to be on this, to be part of this new structure, and that would ensure the guarantee of Ukraine's territorial integrity, and that will end the hostilities that is ongoing. To what extent that is going to happen, I'm not sure. But just to briefly mention, to draw parallels to the Budapest Memorandum of 1993, in which Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons in exchange of the security guarantees, that the security guarantees was that Russia or any other country would not violate the territorial integrity and sovereignty in exchange of Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. But however, 20 years later, we saw again that the occupation of Crimea and now the war in Ukraine. So it is difficult to predict what kind of security system will be at place, but clearly what Ukraine is working on is to gain security guarantees in one way or another.
Okay, thank you very much, Georgi. If anyone else wants to jump on some of the responses, maybe Susie, Razi, and some of our participants at home.
Well, I would like to add a few things to the Minsk agreement. I don't think that's it's relevant anymore because of the fact that both of these parties, they think of it as a unilateral violation of the agreement. You also see that how Russia, as Susie mentioned, and it's because of the fact that Europe has been at peace from a long time, and regions like South Asia, Middle East, and Southeast Asia, they have been facing these issues, the security issues, from a long time, because of which our perspectives to such conflicts are a bit different. And as she mentioned, that Russia operates in a realist fashion, which I totally agree with, because of the fact that it has been disintegrated into many chunks. So it feels a bit of insecurity in this regard. And I will also quote an example of the US-Ukraine Charter on Strategic Partnership, which also validates that US wants to integrate Ukraine in totality in Euro-Atlantic and European Union. So when you come into the fold of Euro-Atlantic alliances or European Union as a whole, it means your image, your position will obviously be uplifted, not only economically, but also security-wise. So I think this won't be a good analysis to say that the Minsk Accord would be applicable anymore.
All right, thank you very much. On that note, I would say thank you to everyone at home.
Just can I,
and everyone.
if I may, just briefly to get to the point.
Okay, just
yeah.
1 second.
So I think that the main reason why Minsk agreement is no longer relevant is because Russia recognized the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk republics, so-called republics, and the main part of the Minsk agreement is to ensure the federalization of Ukraine when these entities will have certain voting rights within Ukraine. So when it's recognized the independence of these are independent states. So Minsk agreement no longer will work in any manner. That's what I'm saying. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we all agree that we hope that we do not live in a world where we would, or the next generation would become refugees, and there'll be a lot of trouble. And we hope that we're building a world where we live. We hope that the future generation will be able to live in a better world than this. And I think this just re-echoes some of the questions that some of the participants have asked, that I hope that we are able to avoid a situation like this in the future. On that note, thank you very much for attending, for your time, for your questions, for your contributions. I hope that you follow the Next Gen Global Frontier and watch out for events coming up after this. And I leave the floor to Salman for 10 seconds, closing remarks, and then we're done. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Demi. I'm really grateful to you for pressing me so hard for conducting this event, and also to all the scholars who were on board, gave thorough talks and provided distinctive perspectives to the issue. When you said, you quoted about sustainable partnerships, so I think that IIGSA's partnership with NextGen is the start of sustainable partnerships. And I think what we can do to create harmony between people is that come up with academic work, which is quality work, which is unbiased, which is objective research, and provide sustainable solutions to them. Thank you very much, the whole team, especially Demi, Georgie, Susie, Razi, Hashim, and Dr. Desari for this event. And we look forward to collaborating more and more, not only on discussions, but also on papers and physical events as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. We'll be in touch for that. Bye. Bye, everyone.